Hey there guys, welcome to our second passive transport lecture. As you guys know, passive transport is diffusion, okay? And what we're going to be learning about today are some factors that make diffusion either occur faster or slower. But what I want you guys to be thinking about during the lecture, okay, is this. I've put the three questions that were most frequently answered incorrectly in yesterday's partner work. So when you guys are doing this lesson, these are definitely the ideas that I want you to be thinking about. And if you still aren't sure what the answers are or why, ask me questions about this, okay? These are things that I really think that you guys should have mastered by now, okay? So with that said, you guys want to pause video and put this in real quick. This is all past material that you guys should know. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes, just pause. And once you fill this in, just pick right up. Okay, great. So again, you guys should know pretty much all of that there. And what we're going to be moving on to now is new material. Okay, so there are several factors that affect the rate of diffusion. And if you guys remember, the word rate, it basically means speed. How fast is diffusion occurring? Okay, so number one, the temperature of solution affects the rate of diffusion. Number two, the size of the concentration gradient this will also affect how fast diffusion can occur. Okay. Number three, how far does something need to diffuse? Okay, we're going to call this the distance of diffusion. All right, and then lastly, we want to look at the size of the particles diffusing. Okay, so there's four things. And I want to note something that can be forgotten. Lots of this is actually common sense based. You guys are going to have to think, okay? Because lots of it, when you put real life examples in, it makes sense. All right, and that's the takeaway, is that when you guys think about these things, I just want you to think about your life because they make sense. So, moving on to temperature, okay? Temperature, the greater it is, all right, the greater the temperature, the greater the rate of diffusion. We call this a direct relationship because as one increases, so does the other. All right? Now, what I want you guys to think about is pretty simple, right? When things are warmer, they actually have more energy, right? They're able to move faster. Okay? And so the higher temperature provides the molecules more energy to move. This is something, again, if we use common sense, it just makes sense. If you look over here to the right, you guys can see that there's an actual picture of what I'm trying to explain. So over here, if you have low temperature, there's low movement. And what you can see is that these little green molecules, right, shown by the size of these lines behind them, are actually moving at a slower pace. Now, if we look on the right where we have a high temperature, it says we have high movement, okay? And if we look at how these molecules are moving, we can see that they're shown to be moving faster. And so, as I said earlier, there is this direct relationship between temperature and the rate of diffusion, the speed of these objects, okay? And here are just some examples I want you to kind of process. Is it easier to diffuse honey in hot or cold tea? Well, it's very difficult to diffuse honey in cold tea because it's very difficult to melt. So it's really in hot tea that this honey gets enough energy to actually melt and diffuse throughout the entire solution. So we're going to circle hot there. Is it easier to diffuse sugar in hot or cold coffee? And again, I want you to think about real life examples. And I think we talked about this briefly in the lecture capture yesterday. But when you drink an iced coffee, this is what you see right here on the right, is that you guys should note that the sugar, right, it all collects on the bottom. Which means that it does not diffuse very well. Now, when you drink a hot coffee, this actually isn't the problem at all. A hot coffee, kind of like the hot water that you put the honey in, it's going to actually allow that sugar to have some more energy and diffuse throughout the entire solution. Whereas that is just not the case here in this iced coffee. And once again, this is a real life example that I want you guys just to think about because it makes sense. So that's temperature. Direct relationship, the greater the temperature, the greater the rate of diffusion. Awesome. So now we're going to move on to concentration gradient. Okay? The greater the concentration gradient, the greater the rate of diffusion. This here is also an example of a direct relationship. And this is because, very similarly to temperature, when the concentration gradient is higher, the rate of diffusion is also higher. Okay, so I think our next question is going to be what makes a concentration gradient greater, right? Well, the way that we're going to define this is that the greater the concentration gradient, the greater the difference between the high and low areas. And so if you look here on the right, I did a pretty simple example of a water in a dam, okay? And on the left side, you guys will note that the water in picture 1 here is very high, and that the water on side 2, right, over here is very low. Whereas in picture 2, the water on the left is very high, but the water on the right is also very high. So it's in picture 1 that the concentration gradient is actually greater, and this is the important part, okay? because there is a greater difference between the high and low concentration. You see here how we have the high concentration, right? It's naturally going to want to move over here to the right if this dam were to break. But down here, is this high concentration necessarily going to want to move if that dam breaks? Or is this high concentration necessarily going to want to move if the dam breaks? Or is it going to move at all? You see, there's going to be much more diffusion here in picture 1 if the dam breaks. Than down here in picture 2, okay? And this is because more particles want to move where there is more space. Now, this isn't the most scientific term in the world, but it conveys the idea that particles in an area of high concentration always want to move to an area with a lower concentration. That is, there's more space for them to move around. Imagine you guys are at a baseball game and the entire crowd was just in the right field bleachers, right? People would want to move to the left field bleachers, to center field, to behind home plate. They're going to want to disperse throughout the stadium. These particles that are going on in our body in solution, they're no different. So moving on to number 3, the smaller the distance of diffusion, the greater the rate of diffusion. So this is our first example of an inverse relationship. That is, as distance decreases, diffusion increases, okay? And something that I want you guys to think about is right here in this example. Imagine we had food dye. So right here, we have red food dye, and we have a very small container, and we have a very large container. If I put the same amount of food dye into each container, after 10 seconds, you'll notice that there's a lot more that has diffused in the small container than in the big container. Okay, nearly 50% more has diffused in the small container. Now, if we wait another 20 seconds, so that our total is 30, you'll note that the small container, it has diffused completely. Right? Whereas our large container has only diffused 25%. This is the best example that I can come up with to really show you this. Now, we're going to be doing something very similar to this in class, in a lab actually coming next week, but this is the main idea I want you to understand. All right, so in relation to cells, it's actually the size of their cell membrane that affects the distance of diffusion, where the greater the size of the cell membrane, the slower diffusion is, and the smaller, you guys can also think of this as thicker and thinner. Okay, the thinner the cell membrane is, the faster diffusion is. And this is because the thinner it is, the less distance the objects, the particles, actually need to cross. And so if we look at this diagram that I drew, it's going to be in the bottom diagram here, right? Because it's only 1 millimeter thick, that's 2 millimeters thick. Because thinner, diffusion will be faster. Okay, it's that simple. Our last thing that's going to affect diffusion is particle size. And very similar to diffusion distance, the smaller, right, the particle size, the greater the rate of diffusion. And so this once again is an inverse relationship, whereas particle size increases, the rate of diffusion decreases. Right? Cool. And again, we can think about this in a very literal context in our day-to-day life. If you put a cube of sugar in hot coffee versus a packet of granular sugar, which would diffuse first? Right? It's going to be this packet of granular sugar because the particles are already small and it's much easier for them to diffuse. What we need to remember is that the cell membrane is packed very tightly. It almost reminds me, if you look on your right, of this notch here, okay? If you notice, right, we have these rocks and we have these people that are walking through. If the people were smaller, more of them could actually fit. And this is the same with particles crossing the cell membrane. The smaller these particles are, the more that are actually able to pass through the cell membrane. Alrighty, well, I know this is definitely a lengthy lecture. Definitely fill out this vocab. And thank you guys for watching. I hope you're really understanding this. It's really interesting stuff. And again, this is happening in your body millions upon millions of times every second.